Good morning, evening, or afternoon to everybody following this channel. Today, this is your host, Victor Tellez, also known as Cristiano Moderno. Today's transmission about Genesis 21 will be in English. Hoy, la transmisión será en inglés sobre Génesis 21. Si alguien quiere seguir esta transmisión en español, aquí abajo está el enlace donde pueden seguirlo. If anybody wants to follow this in Spanish, this is the link to this content in Spanish. Aunque hayan serpientes que insistan que esto sea exclusivamente en español, la palabra de Dios no es solamente para la comunidad de habla hispana. Por eso ciertas serpientes, como una cierta mujer Olivares, que le gusta comentar en WhatsApp, aunque ella se arrastre de rabia, yo sigo lo que dice el Espíritu Santo que me ordena que yo la dé en inglés. Si quieren en español, aquí está la transmisión en español. Having said this, now, today we're going to look at chapter 21 in the book of Genesis. And this is regarding finally, the birth of Isaac. God has spent already 10 chapters promising Abraham that he should have a child through his wife Sarah. After 10 chapters, finally it comes. Let's see what it has to tell us. I will be following the New International Version, and it reads as follows. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Okay, we see here, God gives us his promises, and though many times these promises seem to be taking forever, or even to the point when it sometimes seems impossible, God ultimately fulfills his promise at the time he thinks it's best. God has been promising a son to Abraham, and now that he is almost a century old, and his wife is well over 70, by some accounts 90, they finally have a child. Sarah became pregnant and bore him a son, and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. Okay, we see the name here is Isaac. Now, in Hebrew, in the Bible, the names are not haphazard. There's always a reason behind them. And these first couple of paragraphs explain this to us why Abraham's son through Sarah is Isaac. Isaac comes from the Hebrew word Yitzchak, which in Hebrew means he shall laugh. Yes, laughter. He shall laugh. He will laugh. In other words, laughter in the future tense. If we remember back a couple of chapters ago when God appeared to him in the form of the three persons of the Trinity, right before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see that Sarah laughs because when she hears God promising Abraham that they were to have a child, she doubts. She laughs because she doubts it. Now we're going to see other examples of the laughter that comes forth from this child's birth. Continue saying, Abraham gave him the name Isaac, the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham was circumcised him, and as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. We see here we go. We see that he was already 100 years old, and he finally has his son through his wife, who was just 10 years younger than him. A 90-year-old woman giving birth. Wow. Now, but we also see one more thing here on verse number 4. How old was he when he was circumcised? 8 days. We saw in chapter 14. Interestingly, in chapter 14, the second set of sevens, 7 times 2 equals 14, that God establishes a pact, just like the 7 establishes completeness or perfection. Now, in the third set of sevens, the third set of perfection, on chapter 21, 7 times 3 equals 21, God finally fulfills or perfects his promise. And we see, interestingly enough, in the second set of sevens, 7 times 2 equals 14, in Genesis chapter 14, my mistake, in Genesis chapter 17, is where we, just 4 chapters ago, is when we see God telling Abraham what he expects to be as a sign of his the covenant that he is signing with Abraham, which is what? The circumcision. We remember then that God expected all those who are subject to him to have his the mark of his covenant, not when they are grown up, not when they believe. No, not when they finally understand. No. The mark of the covenant needs to be done while the child is still subject to the believer. In the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, this mark was a covenant. So the covenant needed to be done at the age of 8 days old. Exactly 8 days old. Why 8 days? 8 marks the new beginning. It's 7 days of the creation plus 1 more day, which is new creation. So upon the 8th day, the child was made a new creation through circumcision. Why they followed through the day 8th. Excuse me for just a minute. I'm having a little issue here, which I'm having some technical difficulties right now. Okay, let's continue now. Okay, now we see. Okay, let's continue now. Great. Okay, we were looking at John 21. Genesis 21. Let's continue. We were talking about circumcision. Circumcision that happening at the 8th day, marking the sign of new creation. So by being circumcised at the age of 8 is no longer part of the old creation. He has now been accepted into the promise of Abraham, being thus a new creation. We saw that in chapter 17, God did not care that Isaac was still a child. God did not care that Isaac did not yet understand the statutes of the covenant that God had signed with Abraham. All he wanted was that those who were from Isaac's and Abraham's household be marked with a sign of his covenant. Same to today. Later on, Paul tells us that what circumcision used to be in the times of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in the times of the Old Testament. In the New Testament, under the new covenant with Christ, the circumcision now becomes baptism. Therefore, just like with God not being interested in get the sign of the covenant, but it was mandatory that the father impose this sign of the covenant on his still young son. So too, today, we parents are required by God to impose the same sign of the covenant of baptism upon our children, even when they are still young. And you're just like God did not respect the ridiculous human teachings of, oh, he's just a child. Oh, he doesn't know yet. Oh, he hasn't, he doesn't believe yet. All those are human arguments, denying the requirements of Scripture, which tells us, put the mark of the God's covenant upon your child when he is young. Don't worry if he still doesn't understand. It is your job as a parent to teach him. Don't worry about, oh, he's not choosing yet. He's a child, for crying out loud. Children don't get to choose. Children are subject to the education their parents provide them, especially when they are still young. Furthermore, I forget if it's Ecclesiastes or Proverbs tells us, teach your child in the way of the Lord while he is still young, and yet he will not deviate when he is old. But you have a lot of people leaving the Protestant church. Just the other day, I was looking at about a pastor Islam and was now getting involved in developing lies in favor of Islam to get people to convert to Islam. He's a pastor, for crying out loud. He should have known better. While at the same time, you have a lot of Muslims accepting Catholicism, because in Catholicism, we care about bringing our children in the way of God instead of leaving them randomly to be shaken by false doctrines until they finally decide, oh, I want to be baptized. when it's probably too late already. So God required 8 days old. That means while he was still a child. Thus, God requires us to baptize our children while they are still kids. It is no wonder that in Acts 2:39, in the Greek version, he tells us that the promise of the Holy Spirit received through baptism is also available to our children who are yet sucklings. Let's continue. Verse 6. Sarah said, God brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Once again, these are the second and third reasons why Isaac gets his name. Remember, Isaac comes from the word Hebrew Yitzhak, which would mean he will laugh. Because now we see Sarah in verse 6. Now she is laughing out of joy. Back a few chapters ago, she laughed out of doubt. But now she is laughing out of delight because she is rejoicing at the fact that God has delivered upon his promise of giving her a son. That's why she also says, everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Kol Ishmael al ze Yitzhak iti. In the Hebrew, it says, Kol Ishma, everyone who listens, who hears, al ze, about this, Yitzhak iti, will laugh with me. Yitzhak iti. So there we see the name Isaac, Yitzhak, meaning that she is rejoicing at the fact that God has finally delivered the promise he so much insisted he shall deliver. Verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, this is usually 2 or 3 years old, Abraham held a great feast, but Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham, Ishmael, was mocking. So Ishmael, we know, was 13 years older. So this puts Ishmael somewhere in his teens. The older brother is making fun of the younger half-brother. The son that Isaac had through Hagar, the mistress, is making fun of his half that Abraham had through his legitimate wife. Notice there's a major issue here now, the point of legitimacy. The legitimate child happens to be the child that is born by the legitimate wife. In this case, even though Ishmael was a firstborn, he is not the legitimate child. Therefore, he does deliver to Abraham because he had to be delivered through the legitimate son, in this case, Isaac. But Ishmael, though, feeling himself superior, remember Hagar also felt herself superior, being that she was able to bear Abraham a son while Sarah was still struggling with that. So there was this sense of superiority, this false sense of superiority between Hagar and her son Ishmael over Sarah and Isaac. Superiority we still see today in the and what's going on in the Middle East. Let's continue. Um, Obviously, Sarah is to speak in favor. Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had born to Abraham was mocking. That means Ishmael is making fun of Isaac. And she said to Abraham, I will never share the inheritance of my son Isaac. Remember, the inheritance goes towards the legitimate. Ishmael is still Abraham's son, so he doesn't. And Ishmael, not because of the any love for Hagar. Hagar, after all, Ishmael was still his son. However illegitimate, he's still his child and is still loved by Abraham, because what father does not love his children? So he obviously feels divided. Should I release my son? Should I not release my son? Should I tell Hagar to take my son away? Should I let Hagar keep my son? What do I do? Verse 12, God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. In other words, even though Ishmael is not to receive the inheritance that God promised Abraham, just because Ishmael is still one of Abraham's children, God is going to make Ishmael into nations as well, a nation of nations. 12 princes will come out of him. We'll find that out later on. But God tells him not to be stressed and to follow through with what Sarah is telling him. In other words, Sarah tells Abraham to dismiss Hagar and Ishmael, and Abraham does not want to dismiss them because Ishmael is still his son. God tells them to follow through with what Sarah is requesting of Abraham, because ultimately Ishmael is not the person to Abraham. Isaac is. Ishmael, as one of Abraham's offspring, will have a taste of that promise. But the fullness of that promise is destined to go to Isaac. We also see here that God is promising to watch after Ishmael and obviously after Hagar. Ishmael still being young, and depending on Hagar, God is still going to be watching after Hagar, as we're going to find out later in this chapter. But as that goes on, as God is watching after Hagar, and that way watching after Ishmael, we will see this in the next few verses. Verse 14. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave him to Hagar. And he set them on her shoulders, and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Later on, it seems to us like if it was a child was still small. But right here in the Hebrew, we see the word na'ar. Na'ar means that he is not that young after all, not as young as he presented. And he is somewhat older. Now, Abraham gives them some water to sustain and sends them off. But look where they're wandering. The desert of Beersheba. It is important that you keep this this in mind. Then the desert of Beersheba. Beersheba in Hebrew means the well of the covenant. So that means this area is marked off by a very important well. Today we know, and that well was so important that today it still exists as a city of Beersheba, about 3 miles away from Jerusalem, more or less. Let's continue. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch a boy die. As she sat there, she began to sob. Okay, now, Hagar is frustrated. She is depressed. They are in the middle of the desert. The water has run dry. Dehydration is about to kick in. She is sad. She herself is dehydrated and thirsty. She knows her son is still thirsty as well. This is desert country. They feel death already at their doorstep. But in the meantime, something else happens. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God came to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. God sends his angel. God intervenes. God does not promise that our boats will stay clear from the storm. God promises that when our boat is in the middle of the storm, it will not sink. So God is telling her to take trust in him, to lift up her head as a mother. I don't know what crisis you're going through. Hagar was obviously going through a crisis at that moment. The crisis of no water, which was already threatening both her life and the life of her young son, Ishmael. Yet, God's angel gives her a message of hope. Hope that this thirst, the lack of water, the lack of resources she is going through will not be the cause or the reason of her destruction, nor the destruction of the child. Now, you might be going through a financial crisis. You might be going through a health crisis. You might be going through an emotional crisis. I do not know you. What is the matter? Put your name right there. Do not be afraid, for God has heard the crying. Lift up the boy, or in this case, lift up your face. For I will bring you into greatness. Whatever situation you're going through, God will deliver from you from it at its correct time. And he will lead you to victory over whatever crisis you have. Call out to his name. Just lift up your face. Lift up your head. And this. Verse 19. Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled her skin with water and gave the boy drink. When God tells you, lift your face up, he will provide the resources to you. Also, watch how earlier it said that she was wandering around the wilderness of Beersheba. There's a well right in front of her. This well did not appear magically because earlier we see how Abraham himself digs up this well. That well had been there quite a while because that well had given the oath, well of the covenant. As well, because of the crisis, we do not see God's solution right in front of us. Later on in the Gospels, after the resurrection, Jesus Christ appears to the disciples as they're walking to Emmaus. Yet they do not recognize him. After living with him 3 years, they still didn't recognize him. Why? Because they were all caught up by their depression, by the sadness, by their emotions. They did not see that the Lord Jesus Christ was there with them. The water so much that they did not realize that Jesus Christ, the water of life, was walking along with them. So too, right here, Hagar is thirsty. There's a well of water she could use to refill the water, the skin of water that she was given. Suffering blinds us to the solutions that are out there. Oftentimes, I've had discussion with people who are frustrated with a situation that they're going through. And you provide them solutions. And what do? They shut the door on the solutions because they're so full of their emotion. They don't lift up their eyes. The crisis you're going through, raise your face up and look straight ahead to whatever God is providing you. He's providing an open door. Don't go and shut it. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. Well, of course, his mother was an Egyptian herself. But we also see one thing here. Whereas Ishmael grows up and marries an Egyptian, which in the Old Testament represents slavery. That's why Hagar is considered a slave. And that's why the years of slavery in Egypt, because slave is a symbol. Egypt is a symbol of slavery. The other son marries into the family, into Abraham's family. Being a son, which later on Paul plays into a lot. Are we are we the slaves to sin, or are we heirs, co-heirs with Jesus Christ in the promise of life everlasting? Are you a child of Hagar, a slave to sin, married into sin? Or are you a son of the promise who marries into the family of the promise? Now, verse 22. And God is with you in everything that you do. I tried researching who was this Abimelech. And I found out that Abimelech It was a very popular name among you to point out that it is a title because the word Abimelech in Hebrew means my dad is king, my father is king. So we see the title of king right within his name. So it is justifiable to believe that Abimelech is not the name of the king, but that he is explaining that it's a title that the Philistines gave their kings, Abimelech, my father, the king. Fikol, too, is also title. Fikol was a title given to, as it says here, to the military commander, the military chief. So you see the king and the military chief visiting Abraham. And they're recognizing that God is with Abraham. Now, that God is with Abraham, God is going to act in the favor of Abraham. So, as such, they know that a friendship with Abraham equals a friendship with God. Being enemies of Abraham means being enemies with God. Of course, we see that also as part of the promise that was given to him back in chapter 11 when God calls him. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. Abimelech and Fikol realize that, and they come to Abraham and ask to be kept into an alliance with them, because they recognize that by blessing Abraham, Abimelech and Fikol will be blessed as well. Abimelech and Fikol will be cursed as well. So they're trying to get some kind of alliance with Abraham so that they too will be blessed through Abraham. Deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me the country where you now reside as a foreigner the same kindness I have shown you. Abraham said, I swear it. So that because of the same ritual we're about to complain to Abimelech about the God is Abimelech and Fikol tell Abraham, please don't do anything to us. We've been kind to you. Proving in his case that no, the Philistines were not so kind to Abraham and his people. They've been trying to take and steal the very wells that Abraham had dug up. But now Abimelech is like, oh, what? Somebody's trying to take over your well? How come you didn't tell me this? I didn't know this was happening. So now Abraham goes through a legal procedure in those days. Verse 27. So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech. And the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewes, lambs from the flock. And Abimelech asked, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart by themselves? You see that Abraham did, where he chopped up animals, half on the left, made a little passage between the two halves, gazed at the blood shed by the sheep, and then say the words, So just as what has happened to this sheep, in this case, these ewe lambs, so too may it happen to me if I don't fulfill my part of the promise. So he's going through this routine as a way of swearing that well belongs to Abraham, and that as long as the Philistines recognize that well belongs to Abraham, Abraham will not act as an enemy to the Philistines. An oath right there. They are making a pact. They're making a covenant. But Abimelech, being a pagan, was not aware of this ritual. So verse 29, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs you have set apart by themselves? He replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hands as witness that I dug this well. So these lambs are the evidence. He's giving up these 7 lambs. The word for 7 is Sheva. The word for oath is Sheba, as in bear, Sheba, the well of the covenant. So the place was called Beersheba, or well of the covenant, because the 2 men swore an oath there. So now both Abraham and Abimelech have declared an oath that both people, Abraham and Abimelech, and their peoples will be there. After the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he gathered in the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for the time being. And I'm sure we'll hear one of those crazies from the Palestinian side. You see here supporting the Philistines, the land where Abraham occupied was for the Philistines. The Philistines in the Bible are not the same thing as the Palestinians today. Do not let yourself be confused by them. The Philistines were a pagan people, usually presented as a person with a head of a fish or a tail of a fish. And they were not original to the Middle East either. In Genesis chapter 10, we are told there, as well as in many archaeological records, point to us that they arrived into the Middle East from the Minoan region. So they were originally from Crete, who, by the way, was first originally from Egypt. So these Philistines, in reality, were Egyptians who had migrated to Crete, and upon the fall of the Minoan civilization, they migrate over to the Middle East. That's what the Philistines were. They worshipped a pagan god called Dagon. And the Palestinians, on the contrary, oh, by the way, history also tells us that the Philistines were exterminated with the rise of the Assyrian Empire in the year 700, in the 7th and 8th centuries BC. So between the 7th and 8th centuries BC to the 7th century AD, that's 1400 years, that there were no such thing as a Philistine or a Palestinian. Into Israel in the 7th century AD with Muhammad, as they were trying to establish an empire. So what people now call today Palestine It is nothing more than a colony of Arabs. Their true and rightful land is, by such terms, Saudi Arabia, Gaza. Gaza has historically been Israel. Don't let yourself be deceived by that. That's the reason why the Palestinians speak Arabic and they don't speak Philistine. They don't even know a thing about the Philistines. The Palestinian culture is in direct opposition to the ancient Philistine culture. With that said, today, just like always, remember, long live Christ the King!